Welcome back, dreamers. Your host Ken here with some exciting news that I just couldn't wait to share. Somewhere in Dreamland now has an amazing new merch store filled with custom Somewhere in Dreamland hoodies, t-shirts, coffee mugs, pint glasses, and much, much more. So what are you waiting for? Why not hop on over to dreamlandpodcast.weebly.com and grab yourself or someone else some custom Dreamland gear now.
Danser avec moi. Du cordonnier t'es faite, qu'est-ce que t'as-t-on dans la tête? C'est que moi.
Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, my guest is Stephen Hawley Martin. Stephen is the author of over 36 books, including many on the afterlife and the metaphysical. With his writings, Stephen has gathered a first-place award for fiction from USA Book News and has become the only 3-time winner of the Reader's Digest Book Award. In this episode, Stephen and I speak about the hidden powers of the mind, simulation theory, the afterlife, and near-death experiences. So without further ado, grab your blankets, turn down the lights, get comfy, and let's fade away into
Dreamland.
All right. Hey, Stephen, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, so I'm very interested in talking with you. You've got a pretty eclectic background, don't you?
Well, I guess you might say that. Yeah, I been in the advertising business. I've been writing books for a while, and now I'm in the publishing business.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah, you've published like 36 books, something like that. Something crazy, right?
You know, I lost count, but I think it's at least 36, although some of them are sort of like several books that I put together into one volume, that sort of thing. So I don't know if you count that. But yeah, probably about 36, something like that.
Okay. And you were also responsible for creating the slogan "Virginia is for lovers," and had something to do with the GEICO Gecko as well, don't you?
Yeah, that was my advertising agency that I was a principal in for a long time. The Martin Agency. It's a really terrific ad agency, and I can't take all the credit for either one of those. I mean, they were group efforts, and yeah, we were just talking about Virginia's for Lovers. The way that came about, it was a long time ago, but we had the Virginia Tourism Account, the state of Virginia travel service, it was called, a state agency, and we Virginia gets a lot of visitors from other parts of the country and even other parts of the world, and we've got a lot of history going on here, and we got mountains, and we got beaches, and we got theme parks and so forth. So we were trying to come up with a advertising campaign to run in the places where our visitors usually come from. And somebody had the idea that we should run some ads about, Virginia is for history lovers, or Virginia is for mountain lovers, or Virginia is for beach lovers. And in that meeting, somebody suggested, why don't we just drop the adjective and say Virginia is for lovers? And that's what we did, and that slogan came about. It was a headline for some magazine ads that became the slogan for Virginia, and still is. And in fact, when you ride into the state, you'll see the sign, welcoming visitors that says Virginia's for lovers. So it's been around for quite a while now.
Yes, sir. It sure has. And it's a pretty famous one, actually.
Yeah, and copied by others. New York decided to use, what do they say? Oh, I love New York. Yeah. So, I mean, they kind of copied us, but that's okay. Copy is the greatest form of flattery.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, hey, I want to talk with you about several things, and I want to kind of try to get them all in as much in as I can. But I did read your book on Edgar Cayce, and that's something that Edgar Cayce is fascinated me since I was a little child, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit because reading your book, you're kind of an expert on Edgar Cayce. So I'd like to know how all that came about. What is your interest? And here's some stories.
Yeah, well, it came about because a while back, I guess it was in 2007 through 2009, I had a podcast. We didn't call them podcasts back then. We called it Web Talk Radio. And my interest, of course, and the name of the show was The Truth About Life. And I interviewed all kinds of people who were trying to figure out what life was all about, everything from quantum physicists to near-death survivors to people who were studying the paranormal and things like life after death and reincarnation and all that sort of thing. And so it seemed, I spent a lot of time in Virginia Beach. I live in Richmond, which is only about a 2-hour drive from Virginia Beach, and used to go down there every summer my family would rent a cottage, for a week or something like that. And right at the corner of 68th Street and Atlantic Avenue, only a block or so from the ocean, is the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which is the institute that Edgar Cayce formed back in the 1930s. For those who don't know, Edgar Cayce he lived from 1875 to 1945. When he was alive, and even afterwards, he was known as the sleeping prophet because he would go into a self-induced trance twice a day and answer people's questions. And supposedly, he was able to tap into what's called the Akashic records, which I would say the best way to describe the Akashic records is that it's sort of the hard drive memory of the universe, of the at least of the Earth, and everything that anybody has ever thought or said or done or whatever is stored in the Akashic records from the beginning of time until now. And so he would go into this trance, and people came to him. They would actually, back then, they would send him letters, asking questions. And his wife was kind of the intermediary. She would get the letter, and Cayce would go into a trance, self-induced, and he had a stenographer there who took down everything in shorthand and then typed it up later. And a lot of people would ask him questions about why they had a certain illness, like their doctor couldn't figure it out. And he would go and he would answer them. And Cayce was a very devout Christian. He grew up in a kind of, I guess, sort of fundamentalist household, and he decided at an early age that he would read the Bible once every year. So after when people were asking him these questions, it started coming back often that someone had an illness or some psychological problem that stemmed from a previous life. That they, for example, if they had a phobia about water, he might tell them, well, it's because in your last life you drowned, and therefore that's why you're afraid of water. So these kind of things came out, and he couldn't believe what he was saying. He didn't know what he was saying. He had to find out after he came out of the trance, and the stenographer told him. And so that really shook him because he didn't personally believe in reincarnation. He was a Christian, and of course, it's not part of Christian canon. But then Edgar Casey read through the Bible again, as he did every year, and he actually saw a number of places where that he hadn't really understood previously that made sense when you realize that incarnation canon does happen. So, but as far as how that book came about, Mark, uh, as I said, used to go down to Virginia Beach pretty frequently, at least for a week every summer for a number of years. And I would go over to the Association of Research and Enlightenment, and they have a bookstore there. And being interested in the paranormal and psychic phenomenon and metaphysics, I would go into the bookstore and buy books. Well, when I had this podcast, this talk radio show on the internet, I thought, well, heck, Edgar Casey is a fascinating guy. I should interview experts on it. So I got in touch with the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and I lined up interviews. And I actually interviewed Edgar Casey's son, Edgar Evans Casey, who at the time that I interviewed him back in 2009 was 95 years old, but still very sharp. And I also interviewed Tevin Todeschi, who is, and still, I believe, the executive director of the Association for Research and Enlightenment. And I interviewed another guy named Peter Woodbury, who is an expert on Casey and the Casey readings, who also happens to be a psychologist, and a past life regression therapist, and so on and so forth. So those interviews became not only podcasts on the internet, but the basis for the book that you read. And I, of course, add my own commentary to it and so forth. So that's how it came about. That's how my interest in Edgar Casey came about, and that's how that book came about.
Awesome. And I know a lot of your writing is very much about the metaphysical. For instance, you have several books about life after death, books like How Science Reveals God, The Hard Problems Solved of Consciousness, The Secrets of Life, ESP, Afterlife, The Whole Truth. You've just got book upon book of this. And I'd kind of like to know what got you started in that and interested in that.
Well, good question, Mark. I grew up in a family that was very scientifically minded. They are what I would describe now as scientific materialists. They didn't believe anything existed. If you couldn't see it under a microscope, it didn't exist, which is kind of what the scientific materialists believe, that everything is matter and that there's nothing else besides matter. No spiritual world, nothing that can't be measured, as I said, seen under a microscope. And that was what I was brought up to believe. And that's what I did believe. In fact, that's still what's taught in the school, even though quantum physics shows us that really there is no such thing as matter per se. Everything is vibrations. Everything is frequencies, different levels of frequency. But nevertheless, that's what traditional science teaches. And that's what I believe. Well, when I was about 25 years old, I was single and living in Baltimore at that time. I was working at an ad agency, and I had an apartment with two other bachelors. And one Saturday night, I was really sick with the flu. And, when you're 25, you don't want to be sick in bed with the flu.
Right.
On Saturday night, especially if you're single. And so it's funny because I remember I was reading a book while I was in bed nursing this flu, and it was Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, which is about this. I think I'd gotten to the point where the main character was turning into I call it a cockroach, but some kind of bug, and it was really weird. Well, anyway, I heard some people come in downstairs. It was a 2-floor apartment on 2 floors. and I was up on the second floor in my bedroom. And I heard some people come in downstairs, and then I heard some more people come in downstairs, and then I heard some more people, and then I heard all this din going on there and this music going on, and oh my God, there's a party. And my roommates have invited the neighborhood over, and they're having a party downstairs. And so I thought, well, maybe if I get up, put on some clothes, go down there and have a couple drinks, talk to people, I'll feel better. So that's what I did. I got up, I put on some clothes. It was kind of a struggle because I really was feeling pretty bad. I dropped that book by Kafka on the floor, and I think it's probably still under the bed there, 25, 30 years, 40 years later. But anyway, because I never picked it up again. But I went downstairs. I had a couple of drinks. There were some people smoking something, and, I participated in that. And, well, I started really feeling even worse, terrible. I practically knee walked back up to my bedroom, and I flopped out of the bed, and it was like it was spinning around I felt like I was on the propeller of a helicopter that was taking off. It was just awful. And suddenly I felt okay. And I was looking up at the ceiling, and I saw that there were these little cracks in the ceiling, and there was kind of dirt in there. And I thought, that's strange. And then I turned and I looked down, and I saw myself on the bed, sprawled out like roadkill. And I had this sudden understanding, or I don't know how you describe it. It wasn't really an epiphany, but I was thinking, that's my body down there, and I'm up here. So I'm not my body. I'm my consciousness. I don't know if I made that connection right then, but when I woke up the next morning, it didn't last very long. It probably was a minute or two. And then I guess I just, went back in and passed out, or whatever, was already passed out, and woke up the next morning. But it was very real. There's no question in my mind that I was out of my body, even the next day and even now. And so it started me wondering about what I'd been taught all those years. And so I began on this quest that I continue to be on today to figure out what the true nature of reality is, and whether we, continue on after death and so forth. And I joined the Rosicrucian order, which is a society of mystics that study metaphysical laws, and I took all the courses at that time. They were like corresponding courses, and I made it all the way through all their courses and became an adept. And I read everything I could get my hands on about metaphysics. And later on, I had that weekly podcast where I've interviewed over a course of about 3 years, over 100 experts on different subjects to do with metaphysics. So that's how it came about. And after doing that Web Talk radio show, I started, writing books. And because I'd gathered so much information, I had so much that I was able to do that. And probably the one that sold more than any other is called Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die. And it's, most of what I've gathered on that subject. And I've got a lot of credible sources: the University of Virginia, University of California at Berkeley, Duke University. A lot of major institutions have conducted studies that haven't been really reported on in the mainstream press that I know of. But when you put it all together, it's pretty clear that we are spiritual beings who are having what I call a temporary physical experience. We're spiritual beings, I think eternal spiritual beings, having a temporary physical experience. And it's probably not the first time we've been here on this earth. I think most of us have been here a number of times. And that we come here to learn and to evolve. So that's kind of where I come out and how it all happened, Mark.
All right. Yeah, I know you've written several books on the subject. And all in all, after your show, after after writing these books, after researching everything, is that what you believe happens to us? Do you believe that we reincarnate, and do we ever get off of this plane, or do we continue to get caught in this cycle?
Well, I think we are kind of caught in a cycle, but I do think that we'll eventually get off of it. I think that my opinion is, and I back this up in some of my books, I can tell why and, give some evidence for it. But I think that the whole purpose of life is to evolve. If you look around at everything that's alive, evolves. That's what it does. That's what life is about. And we've evolved. Life has evolved from single cell amoeba, what are kind of animals in the sea, to, we're the pinnacle of life, evolution, we human beings. And so that's what life does. It evolves. And we as human beings, now as individual human beings who are aware of ourselves, we have objective awareness where other things that are alive, animals in the forest and trees and birds and so forth they're alive and they have some form of awareness. They're all aware. Everything is aware to some extent, but they cannot step out of themselves and think about themselves and their own existence and, what I call objective awareness. Well, we have developed that. And as such, we are each now individuals who are evolving, and we do it through one incarnation after another. And that seems to me pretty logical. I kind of liken it to, and I've said this before, and anybody who's listened to other podcasts that I've been on has probably heard it already, but I think that the movie Groundhog Day is a perfect allegory for what life on Earth is about. I mean, if you've seen that movie, you know that Bill Murray's character is a real jerk when he starts out, and people don't like him because he's so self-centered and egocentric, and he has all these encounters on Groundhog Day, and he's part of a film crew that's gone to film the emergence of that groundhog and whatever the name of that city is, town in Pennsylvania, Poxy something or other. And these things happen to him, and he treats people pretty badly, and he acts like a jerk. Well, the TV crew, all of them, including the girl that he likes but doesn't like him, are stuck there for the night because of a snowstorm that, they're snowed in. So, he goes to bed. The next morning he wakes up and it's Groundhog Day again, Groundhog Day all over again. But he is the only one that realizes it's a repeat. Everybody else thinks it's the first, the original day, and all the same things happen to him. And this goes on over and over and over and over and over again. But as it continues, he kind of progresses till finally he is kind of a changed guy. He's no longer that egotistical jerk. He actually is helping people and solving problems as they come up. They're the same problems that have come up, but he deals with them differently. And finally, when he has a perfect day and gets everything right, the next morning when he wakes up, it's February 3rd. It's no longer Groundhog Day, and he's able to move on. And not only that, he gets the girl because she likes him now because he's a different guy than he was originally. So that's what's happening to us, except for our Groundhog Day is each one of our incarnations. And as we come to Earth, we come here to experience and to face problems and issues and so on, and fight dragons and enter the belly of the whale and deal with situations. And a lot of times we screw up and we go through difficult times. But when we go through those difficult times, when we come out of it and look back, we actually have matured a little bit. We've grown some. And hopefully the next time we encounter a similar situation, we'll handle it better. And so I think that's what life is about. It's about evolving. It's about facing situations and difficulties and getting through them and growing as we do. And so, that's my take on what life is about. I do think that eventually we'll get it right, just like Bill Murray's character, and we'll be able to move on to another reality that'll be a whole lot better than this one. So there you go.
Hey, I think that was a really good analogy with the Groundhog Day. I think it was perfect. So
Yeah.
you
That's
also,
what makes sense.
yeah,
Go ahead.
you also wrote a book called "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" And this is something
Right.
that really gets me going because it is super interesting. I mean, it's a subject that, I mean, really is fascinating to me. What are your thoughts on that? And tell me a little bit about the book.
Yeah, well, there are some people, and as you know, as probably most people listening to this know, who think we're living in a computer simulation, that an advanced civilization on Earth, I suppose, has gotten to the point in terms of their technology and their abilities with technology to create computer simulations that are so real that the avatars that are within that computer simulation think they are in reality, when in fact it is a computer simulation. Now, I understand why they think that, because if you are a scientific materialist, which we were just talking about, that means that you believe that nothing exists except matter, that everything is matter. Now, if you believe that, that's the premise of scientific materialism, that everything is matter. There's no such thing as spiritualism, or even consciousness for that matter, existing outside of matter. So if you think that, then you would have to also believe that consciousness and intelligence could not have existed until evolution produced a brain, because you believe that matter, a brain, is what creates consciousness. If you believe that, then you also believe that a computer advanced enough would be able to create consciousness. Well, that then eventually, when technology is, developed enough and evolves enough, it will be possible, therefore, to create a computer simulation and characters, avatars, whatever you want to call them, within the simulation that are conscious, that therefore believe that they're living in a real reality, when in fact they're living inside a computer. Now, that is, my book says, yeah, I can understand how you think that, but it's not so. And here's why I think it's not so. The basis of life is DNA. The DNA molecule is within every cell of your body, has a DNA molecule in it. And that DNA molecule is a double helix that, if you took that double helix and stretched it out, it would be over 6.5 feet long. It'd be over 2 meters long. And what is it? You look at it under a microscope and you see that it looks like computer code. It's, you've seen printouts of DNA,
Yeah.
all those. Well, that's what it is. And what does it do? It explains how to the cell how to make and when to make proteins that are needed for life, that are needed to keep the body alive. Now, I suppose the people who think that it's a computer simulation, that we're living in a computer simulation, think that the computer did that. But the fact of the matter is, to have life in the first place, which the people who created the computer simulation would have to have had for them to have become to evolved and been evolved into humans and be able to create all this technology, that DNA molecule had to come first. So therefore, intelligence and consciousness had to come before matter, or we wouldn't have life. How could it all evolve? One of the quotes that I love is by a man named Rupert Sheldrake, who is a chemist, a biochemist, PhD type he's from the UK, but he's an Oxford educated biochemist. And one of the things he says is that scientific materialists say, give us one free miracle and we'll describe the rest. We'll explain the rest. Well, the one free miracle is that all the matter and all the laws of physics and the laws of the universe came about in a single instance from nothing. In other words, the Big Bang. That just doesn't make sense. And the idea that the DNA molecule, among all the other things that are necessary for life to happen, for that to have come about by accident, it's impossible. I mean, the mathematicians who've calculated the odds of that 6.5 foot long string of computer code that characters in which are so small you have to look at them under a microscope, for that to have come about by accident, the odds are just 1 in infinity is what they say, which means it's impossible. So I can see how they get there if they really believe in scientific materialism, but they don't explain how the first life came about that would be creating that computer simulation.
Well, a lot of people believe that first life that created that is the creator, who is what Christians or anyone would call their God.
Yeah, sure. God did it. But if you're a scientific materialist, you don't believe in God because there's nothing that isn't matter. And God would not be matter. God would be consciousness. Here's what I think. I think that consciousness is the ground of being. You can call that God if you want, use whatever name you want. But the difference between my idea of consciousness being the ground of being and the Christian idea of God, and listen, I'm a follower of Jesus. I think that he was enlightened. I think that he knew what he was talking about. If you read the Bible and you read what Jesus said, I mean, and you have, if you know as much as I do about metaphysics, he was right on. But that culture that he was born into and that he lived in believed that God was separate from his creation. Yahweh was a deity in the same idea that the Greeks had Zeus and the other deities. And in fact, at that time, the time that Jesus lived, there were lots of deities, and the Jews didn't think they had the only one. There was Baal, who was the Philistines or whatever, their deity, and there was Ra, who was a god that the Egyptians worshipped, and of course the Greeks had a whole pantheon full of gods, yep, all of whom were separate from their creation. My idea about reality is that consciousness is the ground of being, and that everything that matter and everything else comes from consciousness. And the quantum physicists that I've spoken with and talked about with this idea say that, maybe you might be right, because that's if consciousness and the unified field, what they think of as what everything comes from, are the same thing. That would make sense. And in fact, it's really what the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Eastern religions believe, that they call it Verda or Brahman or whatever it is, but it's the ground of being. And it is. Verda translates in Sanskrit as knowledge. So they believe that everything comes from knowledge. Well, knowledge from consciousness, to me, it's mind. Mind is the ground of being of all that is. And since mind is all that is, then, uh, well, I'm getting ahead. But anyway, I'll send it back to you. Why don't you see what we want to talk about?
Well, let's talk about consciousness a little bit, because that's another thing that's fascinating to me. And there's some proof that consciousness is like, for instance, the computer screen that I'm looking at. That computer screen doesn't really exist until I make it exist, right? It isn't there unless I consciously know it's there. Otherwise, it's not there. And there's lots of scientific proof behind that. So how does that fit into this whole understanding?
Well, basically, what I think we're living in is in a way like a computer simulation. Only it's I would call it a dream. A dream. The dream God is, or the infinite mind. I like infinite mind better than the word God, because God, to me, I kind of get the picture of who is it? The God that's up on the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
Leonardo da Vinci's painting, I guess, up there. You know, he's reaching down with his hand and touching the human. Well, you know, that's not God. You know, God is infinite mind. And infinite mind is having a dream, and we're all characters in that dream. Imagine that before there were humans, or before there was any life or sentient life at all, then there would have been this mind that was all that is. And that mind wouldn't really be able to know itself, because it wouldn't be able to step outside itself if it was all that is. So what could it or would it do about that? Perhaps it would send little pieces of itself out that evolve into conscious sentient beings and have all kinds of adventures and have problems and solve them, and maybe God is experiencing all that through us, through each one of us, because we're all extensions or little pieces of God that have evolved. We're little life force that has evolved from single cell animals in the sea all the way to where we are now, and we continue to evolve. And eventually, I think we're going to get to a point where we will return to the Creator, but we'll continue to have our individual consciousness, awareness. You know, there's back in the early 1980s, there was three people. There were three people. One was a physicist, and another guy, and Carla. I wish I could remember their names, but they channeled through Carla, the woman, a person, or person is not the right word, an entity, an extraterrestrial entity that called himself or itself Ra, R-A, Ra, who also claimed to have been the Ra of the Egyptian deity, and that he had come to the Egyptians and explained to them how to build the pyramids, and gave them a whole theology and everything, but they messed it up. So he came to Carla and the physicist and this other guy, and there are 5 books that came from that channeled material called the Law of One, or the Raw material, R-A material. You can go on Amazon and buy those books. Well, according to Ra, there are 7 levels of existence, and I'll quickly run through the first few. The first one is like matter, like the moon with no life on it, or Earth before it had any plants or animals. The second, that's called first density. Second density consciousness, and this really has to do with vibrations. Second density consciousness is like Earth with plants and animals, but no humans, Then third density is where we are now, which is plants and animals and beings that have objective awareness, who can step outside of themselves and consider their own existence, like we're doing now. Fourth density is where we're headed, and we're moving into it. And that's where we realize that we are all part of one consciousness, and we think we're separate, or we feel like or experience life and reality as though we're separate. But in fact, we're all connected. We're all one. We just think we're separate because we have egos that have been built up from childhood, and probably we have what Christians would call a soul, what I would call the subconscious, that contains all the memories of previous lives as well as the current one. So when we realize that, we will move into fourth density, which is, according to Ra, the last density where we incarnate, where we come into bodies of flesh. Fifth density, we have, that's when we have, when the Christians talk about heaven and light bodies, that's fifth density. And that's where we combine wisdom and this knowledge of being one being that's having all these separate experiences. And then sixth density is, I don't know, even more etherical. And then seventh density is where we return to the Creator. But I think that something like that is probably what reality is, and how we're headed and where we're going. I don't know that particular that particular way is way it's happening, but I do think it's going to be something like that. And I think we are moving from one age into another. The age of Aquarius. We're moving out of Pisces, we're coming into Aquarius, and that's a fact. I mean, the zodiac is a real thing. So,
I recently spoke with a gentleman who is a scholar of tarot and ancient Jewish text and such, and he pretty much, in a little bit different words, said the exact same thing you just said. With the densities, but they call them something different. They call them different, I guess, ages or whatever. But it's really interesting that to hear that from you as well, because he pretty much described exactly the same thing, just a little bit different verbiage.
Well, and I think it makes sense, and obviously, different people are going to have different words for the same thing, but to me, it just makes sense. I mean, we're evolving. I feel like I'm not the same person I was 40 years ago at all. I'm much more evolved, and partly because I've kind of worked at it, and I've read all this stuff and tried to learn all this stuff, and it makes me a different person than I was before. But I think a better person. So,
yeah, definitely.
There you go.
And I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there, because if I don't, all my listeners that are big into the simulation theory are going to kick me right in the ass. So okay. I'm going to go ahead and put it out there. When you were saying like the all-knowing thing took pieces of itself and made little kind of living vicariously through those little things, and they're out having their adventures and doing that. And then we add the layers on, or the densities. They're going to be asking me, well, hey, why didn't you say something about that being almost fitting perfectly into their idea of simulation theory? Because if you think about it, all those layers or densities, as you would call them, and pieces of themselves, if you take a look at it, and let's just put it in crazy terms, we're playing the video game Sims, right? It's kind of right there on par with that. So I didn't want to get myself in trouble. I had to say something about it.
Well, Mark, I think that you make an excellent point. And I can see why Elon Musk and what's the guy's name? Boston, whatever his name is, who came out with that theory, why they think that it is a computer simulation, because it really does look like that. And if you believe that only matter exists, then it would be possible for a computer to create consciousness. But if consciousness is the ground of being, and if mind is the ground of being, then a computer wouldn't be able to create that. And that's why I think the theory is wrong. But I can certainly see why they think it's real, because they have a different premise. My premise is we start with mind, and mind is what really exists, and that we're all part of that mind. They start with matter is all there is, and so matter means that if matter created reality, created consciousness, created intelligence, created mind through evolution, then a computer ought to be able to do that too. So it's because they stick with that basic premise that all that exists is matter. They have to, then they can have the computer create consciousness.
I think the real answer is somewhere in between there, don't you? I think
that it is like a simulation, except that it's been created by this mind that is all that is. It is like a simulation in the sense it's that's why it so looks like a simulation, because it is in a way a simulation. But the premise for the simulator people is what's wrong.
Yeah.
And my book, Consciousness, the Hard Problem Solved, which you mentioned earlier in the show, is what attacks that idea that, because you know why consciousness is called the hard problem? Because scientists who are scientific materialists, who are most scientists, can't figure out how consciousness is created.
Mm-hmm.
They think the brain does it, and they can't figure out how it's done. That's why it's the hard problem. In my book, Consciousness of the Hard Problem Solved, says all you got to do is get out of that box you've painted for yourself that says that nothing exists except matter. Because when you start with consciousness, then everything makes sense. Really, read the book, and you will see what I'm talking about.
I know a lot of people that are religious. They whenever you mention something about simulation or simulation theory, they get kind of upset, and I understand because it's their belief. But I also think that theory lends itself to their religion as well, because that theory just proves that there's something bigger than us out there creating us. And
the question is whether it's some people in an advanced civilization that are doing it through a computer, or whether it's the infinite mind that's doing it. And as I said earlier, I think Jesus was a highly evolved and enlightened being. Was he the Son of God? Yeah, but we all are, because we're all little pieces of God that have evolved to the point where we are right now. So, I mean, I understand that people who are fervent Christians believe that the Bible is literally the Word of God that is, given through men by the Holy Spirit. And, I think the Bible has a lot of truth in it, but I think it's also a lot of metaphor and a lot of allegory, and that you can't take it all literally. I mean, you take the idea of the Adam and Eve. There had to have been a first man and first woman, and by that I mean the first individuals who had what I call objective awareness, where they could step outside of themselves and think about themselves. The animal kingdom doesn't have that. A deer, for example, antelope who's got a offspring, the lion chases them, grabs the offspring and kills it and eats it. And the next minute, the mother of the calf that's been killed is, off grazing and has forgotten all about it. Well, she doesn't get mad at the lion for doing that, because she doesn't have the capacity to think about all that. She follows her instincts and does she follows what the spirit that's within her has her do. Well, we humans have developed objective awareness. We can step outside ourselves. And that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. It's an allegory about the time in history and the evolution of human beings where we were able to decide for ourselves that what we wanted to do. And the story says to God didn't want us to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the antelope doesn't know about good and evil, doesn't think about the lion being evil because he ate her offspring. And so for that animal, there is no good or evil. For the human being to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's conscious awareness of being able to think, oh my God, that lion ate my child. You dirty lion! I'm going to strangle you.
Yeah.
And so, what it's saying is, it's a time when humans were no longer driven by instinct or the God within them. They had their own. They could make their own decisions about whether or not they were going to have children or whether they were going to go south for the winter or not. They could do whatever they wanted because they had that capacity, and that's what they were no longer communing with God and doing what God would have them to do because they had their own free will at that point after having eaten the apple of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that it's allegories like that, that are in the Bible. The flood. There was a time at the end of the Ice Age when there were lots of floods. I mean, the earth was covered with ice all the way down in the United States, all the way down into Pennsylvania. That's why all those Pennsylvania and New England and so forth, you see all those rocks that are piled up and now fences along the edges of fields. It's those were pushed ahead of the glacier as it came forward during the Ice Age. Well, when all that ice melted, there would be huge lakes of water sitting on top of that ice. And then if when the wall broke at the edge of that glacier, that water would come pouring down and wipe out a town or wipe out a city. And of course, the ocean rose because all that water was going back into the ocean, and cities that were along the coastline were flooded. So okay, there were floods in at the end of the Ice Age, and that's where those stories about floods come from in the Bible, about Noah and all that. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of truth in the Bible. I believe that Jesus was an enlightened being. I think he was a fourth density being who incarnated into third density reality, and he had a message for us, and we've pretty much ignored it and continued to ignore it, which is to love one another and follow the golden rule. And if we did that, we could create heaven on earth, the kingdom of heaven, to which he's preaching. But we don't, and so that's kind of where I come out with all that.
All right. Well, yeah, we've jumped down a few rabbit holes tonight, haven't we?
Yes, we have. I don't want anybody to get me wrong. I think being a Christian is fine, and I go to church with my wife. She's a Christian, and I enjoy the sermons. But I just have a little different take on it all.
Yeah, and I think that's normal. I think that you're allowed to think the way you want to think, and I think that it's a good thing, actually, that people think outside of the box, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
I do want to speak to you about the mind, and you wrote a book called Your Cosmic Mind Power, and I want to know a little bit about that.
Well, I think the point of that book is that we are at the core. We are all one, but also at the core, we are the infinite mind, and that if we can realize that and get our egos out of the way, we can really accomplish almost anything we set out to accomplish. And that's your cosmic mind power is when you can align your will with the will of the infinite mind, which is growth and evolution. And so what you have to do that, first of all, is get your ego out of the way, because the ego is, it's all about me, and, I want to be the king of the world and the head of the whatever. And the way you can really accomplish great things is to find out what your dharma is, what your ability is that puts you in the zone, in the flow, and use that to provide service in some way to others. And that's when you're aligning yourself with that cosmic mind that is, and when you do that, you may not become as rich as Elon Musk, but you will have a really good life, and you will be basically a happy person who is content and fulfilled. So that's kind of what that book is about. It's about how you are part of this cosmic mind, and what you need to do is row your boat in the same direction that cosmic mind would take you. And the way you do that is to get your ego out of the way and to get in tune with that cosmic mind.
Interesting. That is awesome. So let me ask you this. Where does the paranormal events fall into your theories or your thoughts? Like people that see spirits, or people that claim to be psychics or clairvoyants or whatnot. What are your thoughts on them, and where do they fit into your broad view?
Yeah, I think, well, there are certainly going to be charlatans out there who, are using trickery to make you think that they have those powers. But I do believe there are individuals who are psychic and do have psychic powers, and then I do believe that there are people that are able to see spirits. There's one of the people that I interviewed back when I had that radio show podcast. Her name is Julie Bichelle, and she is has a PhD in pharmacology, and her mother committed suicide. And Julie was not raised in a religious family, but she wondered whether her mother still existed or not, whether her consciousness still existed. So she started talking with psychics, and she decided to see whether or not psychics could really do what they say they could do. And so she used her pharmacology techniques. That's where you have double-blind tests and placebos that, and you figure out what's real and what isn't real through that kind of scientific approach. And she has used that scientific approach on many, many psychics now. She has an institute called the Windbridge, The Windbridge Institute. And I think it's windbridge.org. And she actually now certifies psychics by running them through this rigorous testing procedure to see whether or not they're really able to do what they say they can do. And there are people who pass the test and get certified by her. And so, yes, there are psychics who can do what they say they can do. As far as seeing spirits, some people have that sixth sense more so than others. I think we all do to some extent, and I have a very highly developed intuitive sense, but I don't see spirits. But there are spirits hanging around on this astral level. They tend to be those who either don't want to go to the light because they feel if they do, they'll be judged, or they think they might be going to hell because of what they've done in their lives, or they don't know they're dead. And I can tell you a story about that if you want.
Yeah.
Or they are atheists and don't believe it's possible to move on. And for a lot of them, don't realize they're dead. Let me tell you a story. This is a true story about I have my first wife was French, and we used to go to France every summer for a week or two. She would spend the whole summer there, and I'd come over and visit for a couple of weeks. And I had this friend that I made over there that was this husband of my wife's best friend, and that couple this guy had inherited this big old house. It was called a chateau, but if you looked at it, it was more like a big house in the country in Lorraine. And we went out to visit him there. We always spent some time with him whenever I was over there. And he had was just finished renovating this place. And he told me while I was there that when he and his wife would come out there on weekends while the workmen were working on this house. It hadn't been lived in about probably 30 or 40 years. And he put a new roof on it and, put a furnace in or whatever, things that weren't there before, and fixed up stuff that was falling apart. But they would go to bed at night, and as he was drifting off to sleep, he would think he would hear someone screaming for help. And, this went on for several nights. And, it was very annoying, and it was very disturbing. So he one night he decided to get up and he tried to follow and figure out where it was coming from. And he decided it was down in the cellar, and I guess this place probably had a wine cellar or something. And he went down there and looked around. Well, the next morning, he got some of the workmen who were there he took them down to the basement, and there was this one wall that looked a little newer than the others, and he had them tear out that wall. Well, behind that wall was a skeleton. Someone had, he says, probably bopped this guy in the head, put him there, bricked up that wall, and then the guy came to behind that wall and had been screaming to get out ever since. He didn't know he was dead.
Wow.
Well, then when they took the wall down, they took the skeleton out, and they gave it a Christian burial, and the night noises, the screaming stopped. That was the end of it after they did that. So he thought, and I agree with him, that guy was knocked out, but he wasn't dead. And he woke up behind that wall and had been,
trying to get out ever since.
For however long it had been. It could have been 100 years, but time is different in that other realm beyond this physical reality. There really isn't any time. So I'm sure it didn't seem like 30, 40, 100 years to him, but he just didn't know he was dead. All he had to do was just move right through. Spirit could have gone through that wall, no problem. But he didn't know he could.
Wow, that's a fascinating story.
Yeah. So, and apparently that sort of thing is common. There are people, there are haunted houses and haunted castles and stuff because spirits hanging around there. They're apparently, they like to stick close to wherever their body is sometimes. And so, they're probably people. I know this one guy who's very sensitive to that sort of thing, to spirits, and he will not go near a graveyard. I can tell you that.
Gets him, huh?
Yeah, he's there.
I know a couple people.
Too many of those spirits hanging around that place. To me, I couldn't care less. I don't feel it. But.
Now, what about extraterrestrials? I know you mentioned them earlier. What are your thoughts on that? I know a lot of people think that they are us just ascended in a higher power, but I just want to know what your thoughts are on those.
Well, I think that it would be pretty amazing that this little Earth of ours would be the only place where there was intelligent life in the universe. I mean, there's something like, I don't know how many star systems in our own galaxy, billions.
Yeah.
And yet there are billions of galaxies. So, the odds are such that it would be pretty incredible if there were no other intelligent life. But I think that UFOs, for example, are really not what most people think they are. Most people think they're actual aircraft or rocket ships or, flying saucers that have come from other stars or galaxies or whatever. I think they're really coming in from other dimensions. And that's why they're able to do maneuvers that are seemingly impossible to do in this reality, because they're not really the same material stuff as found in this reality. I think that UFOs are ships that are coming in from other dimensions that are not as solid as this dimension. But they're checking us out, and they're waiting for us to reach fourth density. And when we do, then we'll probably get to be buddies with them. And not to say that they're all good or all, I think probably most of them are. But according to Ra, 95% of intelligent life is positive, but 5%, there is 5% that's, evil, what we would call evil. Service to self is what Ra called it. Service to others and service to self. And that 95% are service to others, and that 5% are service to self. And they're the Hitlers and the Mussolinis and the bad guys.
Yeah.
So,
well, Stephen, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk with you. I mean, I could probably go on all night and talk with you about speculation and everything else. Like, I love it. So,
well, I've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll let your listeners know, maybe you can put it in the write-up, to come to my website, shmartin.com. That's shmartin.com, and check out my books. Up at the top there's a menu. Click on the one that says books, and you'll see them all there, and you can click on a cover and check it out, and maybe read the first couple of chapters or whatever. Yeah, do that, shmartin.com.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll include all that in the show notes so that they'll have it right there. And I'll also link it to my website. So when they're on there, they'll be able to click on a photo of you, and it'll take them right over to your website, and they can do all the good stuff there.
Well, great. I appreciate that, Mark. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And we'll have to have you back on for sure.
Okay, good. I'll look forward to that.
All righty, sir. You have a good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that about does it for Dreamland tonight, dreamers. Thanks again for listening, and good night.